You know, one of the quiet frustrations of being a human is that time never asks our opinion. It doesn't slow down when we get tired. It does not wait until we feel ready. It's coming. We live under deadlines. We don't get to choose. We age according to a clock we can't slow. Seasons are going to arrive whether we're ready for them or not. And time decides when things are done. Time decides when things end. And most of the time, we experience time not as a gift, but as an authority over us. Time is always there. It's always waiting. You feel this in a lot of ordinary, small ways constantly. The alarm goes off, whether you are rested or not. The calendar fills up faster than you wish it would fill up. Birthdays keep coming. Bodies change, energy fades, opportunities pass, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, sometimes before you even realize they were there, and we spend an enormous amount of money and effort trying to push back against the reality of time that's always there. And no matter what we discover about how we might somehow slow the effects of time, we never escape the weight of time. We can manage our schedules, we can improve our health, we can delay certain outcomes, and none of those are bad things. But we can't step outside the clock. We're never free from time. We always struggle to admit out loud we are slaves to time, and it is a hard, uncaring master. It doesn't explain itself. It just moves on. Ecclesiastes 3 not only does it not deny that reality, it doesn't even soften it, it doesn't try to spiritualize it, it just names it. Life unfolds in seasons we do not control. Movements arrive and depart on a schedule that's not ours. But Solomon's not just trying to describe our relationship with time here in chapter 3. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 16 this morning. He presses further because once we admit that time rules us, the real question is no longer about time itself. It's a deeper question. It's who rules time? And what does it mean to live before a God who rules time? And Ecclesiastes isn't there to help us master our schedule. It's actually there to teach us something, to confront us with a God who appoints these seasons and these limits and our understanding and calls us not to control the clock, but to fear the one who does. And that's the tension we step into today as we look at these verses in Ecclesiastes. And the first thing I want us to see in verses 1 through 9 is the tyranny of time. There's a time for everything and a season for every matter under heaven. Now, those words should sound familiar. This is the great poem of Ecclesiastes. Read at weddings, sung at funerals, usually intended as a moment to comfort us. So there's some nostalgia tied to it. There's but if we read this as sentimental or nostalgic or comforting, we misread what Solomon's doing here in this poem. Solomon's not simply just describing life, he's instructing us about God. The poem is not meant to soothe us. This is not a poem about peace. It's meant to clarify something we tend to resist. Now, I don't know about all of y'all, but if you're a certain age or you listen to old music, when you hear this poem, you probably have a 12-string guitar and some 3-part tight harmonies playing in the back of your mind and the kumbaya sounds of the birds singing, "To everything turn, turn," right? If you read the feeling of this right, this song should have been written by Metallica, not the Birds. The angst of Nirvana, not the sweet 12-string of some sweet 70s folk music. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to tear, a time to mend. Notice how few this list, if you look at this list, how few of these do you control? How few of these are on your schedule, on your time? You don't choose when life begins. You don't choose when life ends. You don't choose when grief comes. You don't choose when joy shows up. You don't choose when joy fades. These seasons come. Kind of takes the kumbaya moment out of the song. Brent, I hope I'm not giving something away. Brent told me something about that song this week. It's in my head. I got to get it out. The writers of this song leave 50% of their royalties to Palestine. And the irony that Solomon wrote these words, and it's a pro-Palestine. Anyway, that's such an interesting thing. It just shows you, even they didn't understand what they were writing about. They just saw it as something that sounded sweet. But this poem says life is ordered, structured, and constrained by boundaries that we don't set. Life under the sun moves within limits that we didn't design, constraints we can't escape, and under the sun, time dictates the terms. Under the sun, we respond, we adjust, we endure, and under the sun, that reality is exhausting because time is always there. Solomon does something important in verse 9. Thankfully, he interprets his own poem. If you weren't with me, if you thought I was being a little too hard on the verses 1 through 8, well, the poem ends in verse 9, not verse 8. What gain has the worker from his toil? Doesn't sound like the end of a kumbaya poem, does it? See, this isn't a new question. This question goes back to chapter 1, but now it's sharper because it comes right after this list of seasons. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck. What gain has the worker from all this toil? Solomon says, look, if life moves in seasons you don't choose, and God appoints the time, then what does all of this effort produce in the end? What's the gain? What's the point? That's where people quietly break when they get to that question and they face that question in their life. What is the point? And Ecclesiastes doesn't shame the question. It dignifies it. It gives it words. But it does not give us the answer we wish it would give us. Solomon doesn't say, try harder. He does not say, wait long enough and it's going to make sense. He doesn't even say, eventually you'll figure out a way to master the season. He lets the question sit because Ecclesiastes is teaching us that if time rules our seasons, then toil cannot be our hope. If God appoints the times, the meaning can't come from something we think we can control. The poem is showing us our limits, and the question exposes our assumptions, and together they force us to face the reality we'd rather avoid, and that is that life under the sun is not ours to manage. We're slaves to time, the tyranny of time. And until we accept that, we're just going to keep exhausting ourselves trying to make time serve us. Now in verses 10 through 11, we learn God gives us seasons before he gives us explanations. I've seen the business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. Now this is actually a callback to Genesis 3. You want to know what the business is that God's given the children of man? Chapter 3 of Genesis says, and to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you. And you shall eat the plants of the field. And by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground from out of which you were taken. For you are dust. And to dust you shall return. That's the business that Solomon's describing here in verse 10. Not the weight of life, something we stumbled into, literally the weight of time, burden of seasons, the weariness that comes from the clock that starts the day we're born. And Solomon says this is not incidental. It's not random. It's not evidence that God stepped away. It's actually part of how life is ordered. And honestly, that should unsettle us a sense because most of us are more comfortable with a God who rescues us from difficulty than a God who assigns it. We trust divine intervention more easily than we trust divine appointment. I mean, think about it like this. We're real quick to believe in a God that removes us from trouble, but we struggle to trust a God who hands us trouble and says, now stay faithful. But Ecclesiastes says you cannot separate the weight of life from the sovereignty of God, and the frustration of time is not random. The burden of waiting is not meaningless, and these limits of our human control, they're not a flaw. They're a design. They belong to a God who chose this way to govern the world. And that doesn't make them easy, but it does give them purpose. It does answer the question of the meaninglessness that Solomon's been bringing up since verse 1. Solomon says that's the point. Now look at verse 11. I love this part of this verse. I love this part of this section. It says, He's made everything beautiful in its time. Notice what it doesn't say. Don't misread it. Doesn't say he makes everything feel beautiful. It says everything is beautiful in time. Which means beauty is often hidden inside these seasons, this list of seasons at the beginning of this chapter. It means beauty is rarely obvious in the moment. It means understanding comes later, if it comes at all. We want beauty now. God speaks of beauty in His appointed time. We want explanations. God gives us appointments. And the common tension exposes one of the deepest assumptions of our heart is that if God were good, He would make the season make sense while we're in it. That if He were kind, He would explain Himself as He goes. And Ecclesiastes tells us that this is a God who appoints seasons and then calls people to trust Him. And under the sun, that feels heavy and it feels unfair. It feels like the loss of control. Which is why I've said, if somebody's going through a season, don't ever ask them this question. What's God trying to teach you through all this? If somebody asks you that, this is what I want you to ask them. What's God trying to teach you through this? Just flip it on them. Because they're going, what? I don't know. I don't know either. So here we go. What are we going to do now? Ecclesiastes says, look, faith does not begin when the season finally makes sense. Faith begins when we stop demanding that it makes sense. And let's stay with verse 11. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. This might be the most painful sentence written in this section. It might be the most painful sentence written in this book. God gives us a sense, an internal sense, that life is meant for more. We know deep down that this can't be all there is. That's the human condition. That's the existential question that philosophers going back as far as we can read have all tried to address. There's got to be more than this. We feel the pull of eternity. Solomon says God put that in our hearts. We want obedience to count. We want the story to make sense. God gives us this longing, but He doesn't give us the whole picture. And we're aware enough to feel the ache, but we're too limited to know enough to just wait. And that tension is not accidental. It's intentional. It's something God placed in the human heart. And we ask questions that never quite leave us. Why did that happen? Why now? Why this long? What is God doing? When will this make sense? What's God trying to teach me through all this? It's not a bad question to ask yourself. Ecclesiastes says, guess what? Those questions are not going away. God put eternity in your heart. So where does this ache come from? Every culture in every century feels the pull more and more. And the answer that Ecclesiastes gives us is surprising because you might be inclined, if I ask you, where does the ache come from? You might jump back to Genesis 3. Well, it came because of the fall. Adam, Eve ate the fruit. Adam ate the fruit. Now they got kicked out of the garden. Now here we all are trying to fill the God-shaped hole in our heart. No. God put eternity in our hearts before the fall. The ache comes from creation as who we are as image bearers, created with an eternal soul. Now, sin definitely played a part, and I'm not dismissing the sin part, but it was this eternal part happened before the fall. That means we were made for something that time itself cannot deliver. We were designed with a capacity that this world can't fill. And our hearts are shaped for permanence, but we live in seasons. And what do we long for? We long for eternity. And we feel the ache because we're not created to merely survive. We are created for something beyond this. And that's where the ache comes from. Because yes, we live after Genesis 3. Thank you, Adam. But we're made for eternity, but in this fallen world, decay touches us. It affects our bodies. It affects our relationships. It affects our frustrations with work, and joy fades and death interrupts. So we live in a memory. We can't fully recover in a future we cannot see. And we struggle because God's not just put eternity in our hearts. There's some things He's kept from us. And Ecclesiastes says, I'm not going to reduce this ache to some psychological personality or limit it with circumstances. This is a theological issue. You feel this because you were made to feel it as life under the sun. God did not remove the ache. He could have dulled it. He could have numbed it. He could have made us a little bit more content, but He did not. You know why? He placed eternity in our hearts. He withheld understanding because if He removed the ache, we would settle for less than Him. The ache keeps us from mistaking comfort for meaning. It keeps us from confusing productivity with purpose, and it keeps us from believing that time itself can save us. No matter how much time we spend in the gym or on supplements or at the doctor. In other words, the ache's not evidence of God's absence. It's actually evidence of His mercy. It's one of the things that draws us to Him and helps us see our need for a Savior. And this is where faith becomes difficult. I'm well aware. Not because God's silent, but because He's sovereign. But because He refuses to shrink Himself down to our timeline. And we sit in the struggle and the questions and the frustrations of time But it's proof that God's not failed us. But it's also proof you're not God. And Ecclesiastes is never going to let us forget that. It insists that we sit in the tension. And I know, look, this is a tough book. We're 5 weeks in now, and every week, and it's not getting better, right? It's not going to get better next week. Ecclesiastes doesn't resolve this tension until the end. And even then, I don't know how much resolution we get. But the ache is doing gospel work. It tells us something's wrong. It tells us something's been promised. It tells us the world's not our final home. It tells us time's not ultimate. It tells us we were made to live in the presence of an eternal God. But then in verse 12, we do get a little relief. After pressing into the tension, Solomon does something that feels almost surprising. He invites us to live. Look at it, verse 12. And I perceived that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all its toil. This is God's gift to man. Now, this sentence matters as much for what Solomon doesn't say as it does for what he does say. He doesn't say figure it out. He doesn't say wait till it makes sense. He doesn't say master the season, decode the meaning, resolve the tension. He says receive. Receive the joy. See, joy here is not a reward for understanding. It's a response to our trust in the one who controls time. Pleasure is not something that we see and grasp after we solve the mystery. It's something given to us in the middle of the season when the mystery remains. That changes the entire posture of the passage. See, Solomon's not offering escape from time. He's offering us a way in 12 and 13, a way to faithfully live in the season. This is our above the sun passage right here. Above the sun doesn't mean we're detached from reality. It means that it doesn't mean we're floating above suffering or skipping difficult seasons or, having some weird, almost psychotic version of optimism, pretending everything's going great around you when it's literally burning down behind you. No, that's not what Solomon's talking about here. He's saying, look, under the sun, joy's postponed because you keep waiting until you figure it out to have joy. Pleasure, postponed because you keep waiting to be at peace. Gratefulness, postponed because you keep waiting to find out what it is you're supposed to be grateful about. Above the sun, joy and pleasure and peace and thanksgiving are practiced now, not because everything's clear, but because you learn how to trust God. And that's not resignation. Resignation says nothing matters, so I'm just going to power through and endure it. Ecclesiastes says receive life as a gift as God's given it to you. In the birth and in the death. And in the war and in the peace, and in the planting and in the reaping, in the joy and in the sorrow. Rejoicing does not deny that the ache exists. It refuses to let the ache become what controls you. The season is not sovereign over you, God is. It refuses to let frustration become the ruling authority in your life to where the worst thing that ever happened to you becomes the only thing that ever happened to you. And Solomon says there's a point of reverence Fear the Lord. Reverence says, I'm not the master of time. I don't need to be. Reverence says, God's given me this moment, this work, this meal, this breath, and I'm going to receive what he's given me even when I don't understand it. And that's a quiet faith. It's not counterfeit. It's not fake. It's a settled posture of someone who stopped trying to extract meaning through control and learned to receive life from the hand of God. And if we can ever get to this point in life, we're going to learn how to live above the sun in such a unique way. And we'll begin to learn to live in happens in verses 14 and 15. When we recognize that time's not in charge, God is. Look at verse 14. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added, nor anything taken away from it. See, this is the contrast that Solomon's building towards. Everything we do passes. Everything God does remains. Human work is temporary. God's work is permanent. Human plans are fragile. God's purposes are eternal. And we spend our lives making things, right? And these are good things. Careers, reputations, legacies, moments. And Ecclesiastes has been brutally honest that, hey, I'm not saying don't do these things, but they're not going to survive. We'll talked about it last week. You're going to build your career, and some moron's going to take over after you die and run the whole thing in the ground. And what are you going to do? Nothing, because you're dead. Welcome to Ecclesiastes. But Solomon says, no, here's what I want you to do. Say, lift your eyes above the sun. What God does is not going to decay. It's not going to age. It's not going to expire. It doesn't need revision. Nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. It's eternal, and which means God's not improvising. He's not reacting. We're not deists. He's not scrambling to adjust history as it unfolds, like, oops, I didn't see that coming. Let me run over there and fix this mess. God's done it. Look right here. God's done it so that people fear before him. Now, the word fear here matters. This isn't terror or dread in the sense of like, it's the moment you realize you're not dealing with a manageable God. And let's be honest. If you could manage God, would you even want that God? Is that God? God's not manageable, negotiable, subject to your timeline, your compromises. So fear him. Fear is the right response when you realize that time, the thing we're slaves to, answers to God. And then in verse 15, crazy verse. That which has already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. Here's what this verse tells us. To God, time is not repetitive, it's held. Nothing slips through his fingers, nothing disappears into the past, nothing's finally lost. But what that means, we can't alter the fundamental nature of the world. We're part of the cycle. That's not comfort to people that won't control. If you want to manage outcomes and guarantees on your schedule, you're going to be disappointed. You do not have control. I was just telling somebody recently, years ago, Lisa and I went through like Financial Peace University, and boy, we got on a schedule. I mean, look, we're gonna get this debt paid off, and we're gonna be we're going to get all this worked out. We're going to have all this fixed. And man, we were like blowing it. I was shocked. I was like, you know what? This just lets me know we have been blowing some money. And we didn't have a lot of money back then. I mean, we don't have a lot of money now. We definitely didn't have a lot of money back like that. But man, we were doing good. I was like, look at this. In the next 14 months, the only debt we're going to have left is this house. And I sit in the doctor's office, and he says, hey, Scott, you have stage 4 lymphoma. Huh. Okay, now what? Well, guess what? Doctor bills start rolling in. Now we're driving everywhere. Now my little side gigs I always had going, can't do anymore. Now not only are we not out of debt, we got more debt. If I'm willing to trust in the one who's in control, he offers something better than control. He offers stability. Because in that season, we saw God work in ways that I didn't think I would ever experience in my life. And stability rooted not in understanding, not in your timing, not in my timing, not in my ability, not in your ability to make sense of the season or the unchanging purposes of anything other than a God who stepped outside of time, is not controlled by time, is the controller of time, which means to live above the sun is to know that time, as much as it's our master, is not ultimate. Time fears the one that appoints it. And when that settles into our hearts, something shifts just in the way we think about everything. There's a pressure that eases. There's a striving that just slows down. And the need to control gives way to reverence because you realize that the God who governs time is the same God that governs your life. The same God who stepped out of time. And those parts of life that got away, the ones that seem lost, the ones that seem wasted, the ones you look back on and say, man, I don't even regret those, is not wasted in his purposes. That's what he's telling us at the end of this verse. Time still, though. In the now, time's still our master. It still rules us. It still measures our lives. It tells us when things begin, when they end. It decides things for us. We don't have any choice. We feel the weight. We feel the authority. But there's a verse in Galatians 4, talks about the God who is outside of time, who stepped into time. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. In the fullness of time, time not wandering, not drifting, and the centuries that Solomon ached for and ached through, not wasted. This is what this is telling us. The God who controls time set an appointed moment in time and said, okay, son, it's time. When that time arrived, God sent Jesus Christ. And notice what that means. Jesus, God in the flesh, did not escape time. He came under the tyranny of time. born of a woman, born under the law, submitted to seasons, bound by days and nights, measured by years. He waited. He lived within the limits of time. He accepted the delays and the issues that time brings. And he did exactly what God intended. Time mastered us, but it did not master him. He stepped into the very thing that rules us. He bore its weight. He submitted to its limits. And then, through death and resurrection, broke the final authority of time. And that's why waiting is no longer wasted. And that's why seasons in our lives are no longer ultimate. And that's why what time drives away is actually not finally lost. Because that ache for eternity is answered in the person of Jesus Christ. And so we resolve the tension now under the sun, not by escaping the clock or mastering the seasons, but by trusting in the one who entered time and redeemed the time and now stands over the time. So don't silence it with distraction or try to outrun it with busyness or try to explain it away with optimism. There's two versions of that ache. Those that are believers, the ache's still there, but the ache brings us hope because we know the end. We know the person. We've surrendered to him. But for those that have not followed Christ, that's a different ache. It's still not an accident. It's not weakness. It's not failure. It's a mercy of God. It's evidence that you were made for more than this life. It's a sign that time and success and understanding were never meant to save you. And the ache is answered in the gospel. So I've said this, I don't know how many times I've said this over the last 25 years. But for us that are believers, the ache turns to longing. And what are we longing for? We're longing for the eternity that's been placed in our hearts. But we know that Jesus Christ gives us the eternity because we know the answer is in a person. And so Jesus Christ stepped into time and bore its weight and broke its final hold, not so you could have mastery over your life. He came to give you himself. And if you want the true ache fulfilled, that's only going to come through the person of Jesus Christ. Because that ache in your heart wasn't meant to drive you to despair. It was meant to drive you to God. For those that belong to Christ, to hear this is a blessing. You may not understand the season you're in. You may not see what God's doing. And you may not know how long you're going to have to wait in this season. But you're not lost in time. The God who holds time holds you. So receive the day as it's been given. Some of y'all have been given some terrible news in the last few months. And I stand up here and say, Glenda, receive the day as it's been given while you go through treatment. Take your pills. Right? Some people might say that's harsh. I don't see it as harsh. I've lived it. Some of y'all are going to go home. You don't want to go home. Receive the day as it's given. You don't know what my day is going to look like. I don't, but God does. You're in a season because it was appointed. And God says, listen, all I'm asking is wherever you've been placed in time at the moment, be faithful. You're called to trust in the one who appointed it. And as you go, don't live under the sun as prisoners of the clock, but above the sun as a people anchored in hope, and confident that God, who entered time, is still at work in your life, and there's nothing that's come at you that you can't be faithful to, because God's still making all things beautiful in his time. Amen.